Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me? I am not Tony Jones, but I'm here to announce a little segment that we've got on now. Who wants to hear some Qs? Yes. Would you like some As with that? All right, well, ladies and gentlemen, it is now time for the Splendour version of Q&A Live. We can guarantee that there's only 3 convicted criminals on the panel this evening. Please make welcome our panellists for today's Q&A. Give them a big round of applause and keep it coming, ladies and gentlemen. The Free Speech Commissioner, Tim Wilson. Green Senator for Queensland, Senator Larissa Waters. Human rights lawyer, Bernard Collaery. Van Badham from The Guardian. And the member for Longman who had his ID checked on the way in here, Wyatt Roy, ladies and gentlemen. And now, your host for today, a man who will take the sound and quality of your applause and screams and shouts as a comment. So please go wild now for the man himself who runs this Q&A gig, Tony Jones.
Thank you. Hello, 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 hello. You can hear us, can you? Can you hear us up the back? That's very good news. I can't see you, but I better take my sunglasses off. Oh, there you are. Who said that? You can make... I will take that as a comment. Now then, we've got sunshine now, which is pretty amazing, but I'd like to thank so many of you for making it through the rain and the wind and the mud. We do love mud in this country. We love it. We love wading through mud. We love throwing it. And I have to tell you that in recent times on my Q&A program at the ABC, we've come quite used to mud. As we know, mud can't spoil the fun unless, of course, it sticks. But so much mud has been thrown at the Q&A program, the ABC's Q&A program, by News Limited, tabloids and radio shock jocks since a certain person asked a certain question on the program that I thought for a while we'd all have to wear gumboots around the office. I have been pictured in a 2-page spread in the Daily Telegraph with a panel full of ISIS terrorists on either side of me. The ABC logo has been run up the ISIS flag on the front page of the Courier Mail. I've been beheaded twice in Bill Leak cartoons in the Australian, but there's nothing to complain about in any of this, right? Why is that? Because we all believe in free speech in this country. We're all in favour of free speech. It's what we fought for. And Bill Leak, well, he's an honourable man. And my News Limited colleagues are all honourable men and women. Just ask them. They're all run-on players for Team Australia after all. But I want to speak to you today from the bench, still waiting to get a run. And if I ever do get back on the field and play for Team Australia, I'm sure that will inspire another Bill Leak cartoon. And I can see myself now, in the beloved green and gold at last, holding my head under my arm in the shape of a footy. We can all dream, right? And so, back to my fellow team members, all of them proud members of Team Australia, I'm sure it's time to kick off in the second Test Match Q&A at Splendour. And our panellists, you've already met them. Just to remind you who they are: Green Senator Larissa Waters, Liberal MP Wyatt Roy, Human Rights Commissioner Tim Wilson, Guardian columnist Van Badham, who was doing a show here just a moment ago, spy lawyer and former ACT Attorney General Bernard Collaery. Now, some of you have sent questions to us, and I'm very pleased to say we've received some of those. Our first question is from Emily Tonoli. Emily, stand up. We'll get a microphone to you. There you are. Now, for the rest of you, if you want to get involved in this spontaneously, just put your hand up. I'll be able to see. There's a hand up right there. We'll come to you in a little bit. There's another one. There's another one. This is good. This is good. But we're starting with Emily. Let's get your question, Emily. Have you got a microphone? Where's the mics? We need to get a mic to Emily, who's down the front here. Where are our microphones? We're going to need them during the course of the show. There's one. There's Emily over here. Pass the mic along to Emily. She's over here. She's standing up. I'm a very pretty Emily. She's relatively short, but she's only 12. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm actually 13.
Oh, man, I'm so sorry. I demoted you from your teenage years. My apologies.
I have a question for Wyatt Roy. As the youngest ever MP elected in Australia at 20 years of age, you must have had a different perspective from a lot of the old fogey politicians. What do we need to do in order to get politicians who actually act and think like young people?
Thanks, Emma. Is that working? Yep. Thanks, Emily. And I know what it feels like when people think you're younger than you actually are. But look,
how old are you, Wyatt?
I'll show you my ID later, but
okay.
I'm 25. Look,
he's already had it out once today already.
Yeah, I'm glad. So, Emily, look, I think it's a really good question because I think it's easy when we look at politics today to feel pretty let down, you know? And I think modern politics has changed, particularly because of the media environment in which we find ourselves in. You know, we've got a generation where we've grown up with social media, with a real diversification of the media. And I think politicians have responded to that by being very partisan in their views and becoming quite insular and sort of saying we need to attack the other side as hard as possible. And also reducing everything to a 30-second soundbite or some sort of grab that sounds good on TV. And I think we need a type of political leadership where we recognise that that actually doesn't achieve very much for the country. And we need politicians who are prepared to, when the other side does something good, concede a point and say they've actually done something good. And I think when we look at politics, we sort of say, well, we just need more bipartisanship. And I agree, but that's not bipartisanship where we just agree with the other person. It's actually where we try and create policies together. And I think we can recognise there are really big challenges for our country. And if we can come together, at least in some part, to do that, I think that's what will help inspire people about politics. And I'll give you a great example. Last week I went away with a Labor MP called Ed Husick from Western Sydney. And he and I are both really passionate about innovation and entrepreneurship because it's such an important thing about how we change our country. And we've committed to work together to create policies together. And we'll get criticised for that. We'll get criticised by our own political parties for that. But I think that's the sort of thing that we need to do to, you know, inspire people about politics again because we need that vision for our country.
Hey, Wyatt, when you stand up in the coalition party room, please feel free to applaud him. When you stand up and say that sort of thing in the coalition party room, how's it go down? Because there's an implicit criticism of your own leadership and the government.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is not, you know, partisan to the Liberal Party or the Labor Party. I think it's very easy to look, or even the Greens for that matter, I think it's very easy to look at that. And for many of them, their reaction is, no, let's just stick the knife into the other side. But for many people, many of my colleagues, I think they do realise that our country has the ability to be an amazing country. I think we're on the cusp of either greatness or something else. And the approach that I think we need to take to politics, and I've said this a lot, is if we are to achieve reform for our country, which I think we want to do, the process will look different. But I think we just have to go through a process where we say, do we agree that there's problems and challenges, yes or no? So usually I would say yes. Do we agree that there are solutions? Now, Labor solutions, Liberal solutions, whatever they are, let's put them on the table. And then let's decide what we can agree on. And we're not going to agree on 100%, but if we can agree on 70% or 80%, I think that's what we need to do. People criticise that in politics, but I'm always optimistic because there are lots of good people in there who want to do the right thing.
Okay, one more question. I'll pass around to the rest of the panel to hear more on this. But is that a problem of leadership?
I think that we...
on both sides of politics.
Yeah, and look, I can understand when people look at politics and they feel let down by the leadership of the Labor Party, the Liberal Party or the Greens. And to give you an example, I think the new Greens leader, Richard Di Natale, is a really big change for the Greens. When Christine was leading the Greens, I thought she took this partisan approach and took this, you know, let's just attack the other side. Where Richard, to his great credit, I think is prepared to sit down at the table and say, what can we agree on? And I think that we do need to see leadership like that, and I think our country will be better for it.
Okay, I'll go to the other politician on the panel, Larissa.
Well,
You might like to respond to that compliment.
Yes. Well, thank you, I think. Thank you, everyone. And good on you, Emily, for asking the first question as a young woman and telling Tojo your real age. How do we make our parliaments more representative and get young people's perspectives? Well, start by having a more representative parliament is the chief answer to your question. We've still only got 30% women in the parliament. We've still only got 3 Aboriginal MPs in both houses of parliament. We don't have folk from many other cultural backgrounds at all. And we do have an awful lot of older people, and they're mostly blokes. So I think the way we get better decision making is to attract more people to the parliament that are genuinely representative of our community. So that's the first point. Secondly, I think even though there's an awful lot of old men wearing blue ties that don't understand climate science, it's really crucial. It's true. You wish it wasn't, but it is. We do need to think on, I think that's, and I agree with Wyatt on this point, politics has become all about the short term, and I think that makes for bad decisions. It makes for pathetic mudslinging, but it also makes for bad decisions. If you think about climate change in particular, that is something that you're going to be living with. We're already seeing the consequences of it now, but we are leaving a legacy for your generation if we continue to say that wind farms are ugly and try to bribe universities with $4 million to host climate skeptics. So we've got quite a way to go in terms of adopting a better and more science-based approach in the Parliament on climate. But I think the long-term perspective is something that we all need to work on. And I welcome the fact that we've got younger people starting to enter the Parliament. Wyatt, good on you. You've got a fresh perspective, and I think that's great. And I wish you all strength in your party room.
You're not that old, Larissa, as well, you know.
I know, I feel prematurely old, but I am technically still young. Although I don't know any of the bands playing at this festival. Isn't that terrible? I know,
I'll help you out later.
About 3. Anyway, I shouldn't have sold.
You'll find out by the end of the day. Tim Wilson.
That's the president of my fan club. I haven't met him yet, but it's great to meet you.
It's a small fan club, but I think they're pointing to the fact. They're pointing to the fact that you are still young yourself.
That's right. That's right.
Maybe it's time to enter politics before it's too late.
I think I saw your mum in here before.
Oh no, my mum is safely in the great state of Victoria. On the substantive question though about getting more people and more young people voices in politics, I couldn't agree more. But that's up to you. And I don't say that in a dismissive way. Obviously, if you're actually 13 years old, you can't run for Parliament or you can't vote. But it's up to everybody in this room because in the end, we elect the people who sit in that place. There's no ambiguity about that. We make choices about who we vote for. And once they're there, they represent us. So if you want more young people, you need to stand up and be involved. And I've always been a big fan, and as an independent, non-partisan statutory officer, I have no issue in saying that if you believe in politics and you're engaged and you're interested, you should be involved and join political parties or stand for office, whichever one it is. But I would caution against the idea that we can come up with answers that are the sort of perfect policy solution. One, democracy is about choice, and we need to be able to make decisions about different candidates based on different policies and based on different priorities. But politics is also about the questions you ask. Most people think it's about the answers, and the questions you ask are heavily informed by your value set and what you think is important. If you think economics is the most important issue and we have to prioritise that, when you ask questions, you'll come up with particular answers. If you think it's the environment or social issues or fairness or justice or human rights or different policy positions, you will get different answers to the questions you ask. And I think we need to be very mindful of that, and that's why people should stand for politics and stand up, because they have different questions they want asked, and that will deliver you very different answers.
Just on a side issue, I'm so glad to hear you complimenting a 13-year-old on asking a question. The Australian newspaper seems to have set a limit. If you're 10, you can't ask a question. If you're 13, it's probably okay.
I'll take that as a comment.
Very good. Let's hear from Van Badham.
Well, I mean, despite your age, Wyatt, and Wyatt's very charming, and this is obviously not personal, but you're a member of a conservative party, and the notion of conservatism is looking backwards. And in this country, it's about the preservation of ideas that belong in the past. You have Christopher Pyne defending the kind of education system which is based on buying in, which was the reason why a lot of people in this room, their parents, like my parents, never got the opportunity of a university education because it was buy-in. You have an anti-science agenda, which has seen cuts to the CSIRO and attacks on the science ministry at probably the most scientifically critical moment for human survival. You know, you have a Prime Minister who defends conservative positions around the role of women, who advocates against marriage equality, that's based in an ideological vision which is largely fantastic of how great things used to be when they were actually a lot more awful than this. And it confounds me to meet young people who are conservatives because I see you perpetrating a view of the world that's based in a fantasy of what was unfair, what was exclusive, what conferred privilege on some and took opportunity away from many others.
You pick up your microphone, Wyatt. You may need it.
Well, as I said, I think that demonstrates how we can't have a rational political discussion in this country. And for me, as a conservative, I'm a conservative and a liberal. And as a conservative, I think let's take the best of what works, let's maintain that and try and reform into the future. And I think conservatives are quite reformist. But as a liberal, I believe in some really powerful philosophy. The most powerful philosophy of that is that individuals are smart people. They should be free to determine how they live their own life, and they shouldn't have the government interfering in their life. They should have the right that if they are aspirational and they want to work hard, let's champion that and let's do everything we can to support that. And as a liberal, I also think that the great equaliser in our society is equality of opportunity, not subsidy, not redistributing wealth, but giving people equal access to healthcare or education. And we say, what is it that the government does? Let's make sure we do that as good as we can. And if I take that philosophy, you attacked the conservative philosophy and you used ideals like same-sex marriage, I think you brought up in your thing.
Marriage equality.
Marriage equality. So the Conservative Prime Minister in the UK says he supports same-sex marriage not despite being a Conservative, but because he is a Conservative. John Key, the Conservative Prime Minister of New Zealand, says that he supports marriage equality because he is a Conservative. And for me, I do support it because I see as a Conservative, long-term committed relationships are a good thing. And as a Liberal, I say we shouldn't have government in our life, and currently the government regulates people out of something. So I actually take my philosophy, and rather than a partisan political attack, I apply it to those things in that rational way.
Well, I'm not partisan political. I'm not aligned to a political party. I'm explicitly not aligned to a political party. And my message around, and you make a really good example about David Cameron backing marriage equality. He didn't back marriage equality because it was inherent in his ideological convictions. He backed, because he didn't in his previous governments, he backed marriage equality because electorally he had no other option. Because the argument had been won by activists, the argument had been won by the community, and popular sentiment was that marriage equality was a fundamental human right. And the reality of any political engagement in a democracy is politicians go where the votes are. If you want to make a difference, studying the Australian marriage equality campaign is a really good one. Because even 10 years ago, you did not have a majority opinion in support of that.
Sorry, firstly, we need to make clear, you have no idea what conservatism is, with respect. And I am not a conservative, but you have no idea what it is. And you, in fact, just invoked a whole series of conservative positions around different issues, like the human right to equality before the law was developed by classical liberals and remains a conservative position. You're now using it to invoke exactly the argument Wyatt just made. That is what conservatism is about. It is about looking at the value of what we have and preserving the best of what we have while looking at dealing with the challenges of the future, understanding why we value those important principles, understanding why people fought and died to preserve equality before the law, free speech, free association, religious freedom, and all of those other fundamental principles, and looking at how we keep and preserve those while addressing the challenges of justice into the future.
Okay, I'll bring in Bernard. Hasn't had a chance to get in here, but I'm going to give him a chance.
I just want to speak from the coalface. I'm in court defending people who are having their rights removed from them. And the reality is that Wyatt has chosen a very hard road. And if he was young Labor, I'd say the same. it's going to be so hard for you young guys to go up through those party rooms and speak up in the party rooms. I get the idea that Wyatt's going to speak up in the party room, so we should give him the room to do it. Good on him. And the reality is I'd say the same for some young Labor guy, but where I'm placed is I'm defending people who are being treated the same way as Putin is treating some of his citizens in Russia. That's what I'm up against. I'm up against a totally compromised leadership of the main parties in this country. Just look at East Timor. Those leaderships are totally compromised on the future of that poverty-stricken country. And look at the way they've treated the exposure of unlawful activity. Look at it. And so who has stood up in the current party rooms for us, those whose law practices have been raided, whose staff have been held incommunicado, who've had their phones taken off them, not allowed to go to the bathroom for 6 hours? Who is standing up for them? No one in the mainstream
party
room.
Bernard, I'm going to interrupt you there because we actually have a question on this subject. It'll help people who don't know the story so well to address it through a question. We've got a question from Sulet Dreyfus. Where is Sulet? Over there. Thank you very much. We've got a microphone to you. Get ready to put your hands up, guys, because I'd like to hear from the audience as well after we do this. Go, Sulet.
Yeah, so I've heard it said, I don't know if it's true, that something like 60 or 70% of Australia's spying budget is spent on around resource extraction and oil. And I'd be interested if you could tell us the tale of the ASIO raid on your office, what its relationship is with the Australian spy agencies spying on the East Timorese cabinet room, and was that done for the benefit of big oil corporates?
Thanks, Sulet. Great question. Witness K is an Australian spy who came forward and complained internally and appropriately about an unlawful activity whereby for Australia to gain extra revenue and for oil and petrol conglomerates to be advantaged, Witness K and team went into Dili, East Timor, and bugged the East Timorese government's cabinet room so that the deliberations while Australia and Timor was negotiating a gas and oil deal could be overheard and outfoxed. And so we went and outfoxed this poverty-stricken little country that's got one in so many babies dying before the age of 6 years. And who did we help? We helped the mining and petroleum conglomerates. And if we've got a leadership that will do that, what are they doing to our Indigenous brothers and sisters on mining and oil and gas issues on their land?
Yeah.
So,
Bernard, I'm going to just to help people who don't probably know this story as well as I've now, having spoken to you about it, come to understand it. Witness K, who you've just referred to, and yourself, your officers in Canberra at least, because you weren't in the country, were both raided in November 2013 by ASIO, by ASIO operatives.
Yes.
Tell us why they did that.
I'd gone to The Hague for the international arbitration for East Timor against Australia over the bugging, and I got a phone call. I was woken up in the middle of the night. 15 or more ASIO officers had entered my law practice and my home and Kay's home. They went first to the ceilings and under the house and under the houses to take things out. So we realised they'd already been there and had bugged our offices, our homes. And then they spent 6 hours. They took the mobile phone off the only staff member present, a young lawyer. They held her incommunicado, and they went to and from my law practice, going through 30 years of work I've done for East Timor, lots of sensitive, important material. I don't know what they were doing. She said they were black boxes, and then we were due the next morning in court against Australia. So where would that happen except in Russia? And so
what's the importance of Witness K to the case that you're running in The Hague, International Court of Justice?
Witness K had his passport seized, and Witness K could not travel to give evidence in the case. That's what Australia did, and that's the position to date. And then the Attorney General, George Brandis, went under parliamentary privilege and described me as a criminal and described Kay as a person who may have breached the Official Secrets Act, etc. So suddenly, under parliamentary privilege, the Attorney General, George Brandis, was able to say that in this country now, if you report a crime, it is a crime. That's what it amounted to. Now, the Greens have stood up heavily on it. Nick Xenophon has stood up heavily on it. And Andrew Wilkie has stood up on it.
Now, are you allowed to say in this room who Kay is and who he worked for? Or she, if it's a she. And Australia asked for an adjournment of the proceedings in The Hague. East Timor was too generous in agreeing to it, and George Brandis pushed through a new schedule to the National Security Bill that mean that I can't answer those questions at all, and it's a 10-year penalty. So just explain this. I know the law you're talking about says that Australian spying operations are sacrosanct now when it comes to journalistic or other exposure, and if you say what happened in a spying operation, you could be subject to a 10-year jail sentence. Is that as
Yes.
you understand it?
Yes. So
how does a witness like this give evidence at the International Court of Justice if by giving evidence they're breaking the law?
What the law did, it extended the extraterritorial reach of the law. So even though we're in The Hague, and the Hague rules give us what's called immunity, we commit a criminal offence by assisting Kay to give that evidence. And that applies to our whole team, all the lawyers, and that's where that issue lies, and it's waiting for leadership. It's waiting for young politicians like Wyatt and others, and further to support the Greens and the Independents on this issue, because we've got this arbitration continuing in this following year, and what are we going to do? What's Labor doing? What's the Coalition doing about allowing the truth to come out about us cheating Timor?
Okay, I'm just going to throw to Wyatt. Your name's been raised in connection to this.
Yeah,
I think he's looking for a champion in the party room.
Yeah,
are you going to jump up to that one?
Well, I mean, this is something obviously I don't know that much about, but I'm quite happy to have a chat afterwards. And
that's why I painstakingly got him to set out some of the issues. So, how does it sound to you, prima facie?
Well, I mean, it is very hard, I think, to make. I mean, we've heard one side here, and I'd always want to hear the other side, and particularly when we're dealing with intelligence matters. From what you were saying, most of this occurred under the former government, is that right? Under the former Labor, yeah. So I mean, I'd have to have a look, and it'd be a bit hard to go back and say
it's true.
What
it happened in 2004, is that right?
Yeah.
Under the
Howard government.
Time. Under the way before your time.
Exactly.
Under the
but I'm quite happy to
auspices.
have a chat, and we can find out, and I can talk to my colleagues.
Yeah. Okay. Just tell us, by the way, the politicians that were involved in this, however they were involved at that time, who were they, and what do you know that they did that you can actually say?
Well, there is a complete proof that the bugging was ordered to assist the negotiations in 2004, and those orders came from the minister responsible for the ASIS, the Australian Secret Intelligence Service, and those orders went from the head of ASIS, the then head, David Irving, to witness K. It's simple as that, and witness K's evidence, if witness K stays alive, is determinative.
You're talking about the then Foreign Minister,
yes,
Alexander
Downer.
Okay.
Yep.
And I don't know how much more we can say about this without all being arrested for 10 years, Bernard, but let me throw over to the Free Speech Commissioner.
I'm the Human Rights Commissioner, but this is a...
So I was going on what Julian introduced you as a Free Speech Commissioner. I thought he must have known something that I didn't. Anyway, the Julian described Free Speech Commissioner.
That's very kind, thank you.
You are a champion of free speech.
I am a champion for free speech, and this is a classic example of why I'm wary of the easy line that what we need is more bipartisanship. If you ever want to see an area of public policy where you get an extreme amount of bipartisanship, and don't get me wrong, a lot of national security laws I support very strongly, is in the area of national security. Often Labor and Liberal get together, they negotiate a deal, and there's actually surprisingly little public debate. I mean, it doesn't matter whether it's in terms of data retention, whether it's in the recent amendments related to National Security Legislation Amendment Act around limiting speech on the basis of advocacy of terrorism or any of those things. They tend to go through the Parliament without the amount of debate that I think is necessary, particularly when they go to the heart of limiting people's basic liberties, such as the recent Foreign Fighters Bill. None of that's news. I said that all the time, but unfortunately it gets very little air coverage or time. So just saying more bipartisanship isn't of itself a solution. But in terms of the actual provision, I'm not familiar with the exact details, so I'd be very wary and be cautious about making comment. But I would have thought that...
I think we're all being cautious with a 10-year jail sentence hanging over our heads.
I don't have any details, so I'm not going to be in that position. But even within the structures of having penalties for people who breach specific bits of information which are sensitive or related to national security, you can still have closed sessions where you can have information provided to make sure there are proper assessments of judicial proceedings. And that's what we need. But equally, I was very critical of the changes to national security laws which introduced significant increases in penalties around certain speech in the last year. And I think we've got to look at all of these things. And I think the Australian Law Reform Commission at the moment is doing a review of a lot of different laws and looking at the implications they have for foundational freedoms. And I think it's going to show just how much there have been breaches, and they've been supported by different parties at different times because they've had some sort of progressive agenda at the time.
Okay, we've got a question down the front here, very front row. We'll get a microphone down to the front row. Before I come to that question, and I want to hear from Larissa as well, but I'm just going to quickly go back to Bernard. Grab your microphone. You mentioned, I think, Woodside Petroleum did pretty well out of this oil and gas deal. There was finally... Was there any subsequent connection between officials or politicians who made the decisions that you're talking about and Woodside Petroleum?
Well, you've got to see this. I'll just respond to Tim a little bit. There's no national security issue here. Getting extra revenue for an oil company that repatriates most of its funds abroad isn't anything to do with national security. We don't have any shortage of gas either in this country, so there's no national security issue involved in this matter at all. The question that Tony asked me, well, I mean, it's a difficult issue to comment. I can say this about Woodside, that the head of the department in which ACIS operates joined, in that following year, joined the board of Woodside. Does that get any closer? And of course, Gary Gray was ALP National Secretary. He joined Woodside as an executive official. Then he went into the federal parliament, and then he became Minister for Petroleum. Funny that. So what more do you want to connect politicians and Woodside with?
Okay, Larissa Waters.
Thank you. Firstly, can I just thank...
By the way, we should add here, because we need to be careful on a whole bunch of legal grounds. We're not actually saying that any of these people did anything wrong in doing this, just pointing out the fact. Okay.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to contend that they did something wrong. But firstly, I just want to thank Bernard for standing up for human rights and for what's right. Well done. And more strength to your arm. You've raised so many fascinating issues, and I guess the whole bugging to inflate the profits of a private oil and gas company makes me think of the broader influence that the fossil fuel sector has on our parliamentary decision-making process. At the moment, it's basically the mining companies that are in charge. The Parliament's effectively just a rubber stamp, it feels like, on many days. And look at the repeal of the carbon price, look at the repeal of the mining tax, look at the fact that there has not been a single coal seam gas well or coal mine refused under our federal environmental laws. Never a single refusal. These companies are used to getting what they want. They make generous donations to both big parties, and they somehow end up with the policies that suit their own private agenda. So I feel like the Parliament is needing to reassert its own authority and needing to remind itself that it actually represents human beings and not big corporate interests.
All right,
so
better get Wyatt just to respond to that.
Well, I mean, I understand where Larissa's coming from, but the reality also about the fossil fuel industry is
Might need to get the microphone a bit closer.
It is a massive, massive employer, and I have
No,
an
it's not. It's
electorate.
2%,
I have
right?
an
It's
electorate. I have an
2%.
electorate plus all the
2%.
flow on. I have an electorate with nearly 10% unemployment, youth unemployment over 20%. And anybody can go out and get a job in the mines. I mean, that is an amazing thing in a country like this where they can get a big
2%
wage. And saying to these people that we need to shut them down the next day is not a reasonable
saying
thing for
that?
our country
Who's
to
saying
do. I don't think that's a reasonable thing. And I don't
Well,
think
it's a straw man
demonising
argument.
them to the point of saying they do such terrible work that the people that they employ don't deserve the jobs they have is something that I think needs to be balanced out.
Okay.
I think that's a
now
bit of a
Van
tricky
wants to jump in
rhetorical-
here, but I want to go to... Can I go to my question first?
I was just going to remind everybody that the arts actually employ more people in this country than the mining industry.
That's factually inaccurate.
Let's go to our...
Hang on, wait,
I can
that's
give you
actually...
the
Hang on,
report.
guys. Hold on.
There is direct jobs and there are indirect jobs.
Yeah.
And the fact is that when a mining company makes investment, it then employs banks. It then employs lots of people down the full supply chain. So the idea that it's just based and can be judged purely on the number of people who are directly employed is putting a lot of you would be out of your jobs if the mining sector went
Tim,
away.
a lot
And the
of
same
them,
argument
a lot
could
of
be
them
made
have their
for the
hands
arts
up.
industry.
Hang on, guys. A lot of them have their hands up. So I'm going to try and get to some questions from the floor. Go ahead, starting with you.
Thank you.
Tell us who you are.
Xavier.
Okay, Xavier.
What role does the panel think the state should play in enacting change in societal perceptions in terms of something like queer rights or the emancipation of women? And how does that play in the context of Wyatt's view on the role of government and Larissa's experience as a woman in politics?
Okay, we'll go to Larissa first of all.
Great question, Xavier. Thank you. You go to the heart of it. I think our system is meant to be a representative democracy, so we're meant to reflect your will in the parliament. Now, obviously, somebody voted for Tony Abbott, and let's hope they don't do it again. But we know you did, and good on you. You found your voice, mate. Go for it. So I think clearly the mood for change is on, and the fact that for the last 7 years we've had a bill in the parliament for same-sex marriage rights that initially people scoffed at, we've gotten closer and closer to actually getting legislation through the parliament. And it doesn't matter if it's not ours. I don't care who's got their name on the bill, but I think that reform is inevitable. So that's exciting. In terms of women's equality, I tell myself that we've come a long way, but reality check, we've got an awfully long way to go when we've got, as I said, only 30% women in parliament, when we just had the gender pay gap get worse for the first time in 2 decades, and when you've still got women retiring in poverty and the largest growing cohort of homelessness is older women, we've still got a long way to go in terms of women's policy.
Let's see. We've got quite a few questions, so I'm going to hear from Tim and then we'll try and go to some of the other questions. Get a microphone to that hand up there. And we'll get a microphone way down the back as well, because a number of people with their hands up way down the back, and they shouldn't be excluded simply because they're at the back of the room. Tim.
Well, the job of government, first and foremost, is to create a framework to preserve and protect, in a liberal democracy at least, our freedom. And that means you have institutions that exist to preserve that freedom. And that's the parliament, that's the courts, to hold them to account in terms of the interpretation of laws, etc., etc. And then after that, the parliament reflects us. So what is the responsibility of the parliament? Well, it's to reflect us, and it's also to be a contributor towards change. But it also shouldn't impose change against an unwilling public, because then we cease to be a democracy. Now, I've been an advocate for, say, for instance, marriage for same-sex couples.
How do you judge whether the public is unwilling, particularly on this issue where the public, by all opinion polling, seems to be overwhelmingly in favour?
Well, that's why we have... That's why we have elections every 3 years, is to assess whether the key issues that are being put on the table match the priorities. Because while I agree 100%, I mean, I first advocated for marriage for same-sex couples on your program, Tony, I think 9 years ago. I think it was one of the first episodes. And that was when it was unpopular to do so, let alone where it is now today. Because we've won the argument and we've won the narrative that the basic... conservative principle of equality before the law should be applied to everybody. So we all have to be part of that change. We have periodic elections to assess whether they're meeting that, but what people say they support may not be the primary issue, because in many issues around politics, there are trade-offs, there are consequences. You can't just make decisions without recognising there may be some consequence to another person, to their rights, to their interests, and the role of the parliament is to make an assessment. But if you want change in society, you have to be part of that change. You have to live your values. Stand up and be proud of what you believe in, because that is the only way you'll see change in society.
Well, you might be able to live your values, but actually getting married is not possible.
Well, and that's precisely why I'm in a same-sex relationship. I haven't been engaged to my partner now for 6 years, because I thought it wasn't just enough to advocate for the policy, though I do. It was that I had to live up to that and say to the Australian people, as somebody who's in the public eye, that I love my partner so much that I want to get married to him. And I think we will provide the foundations for a stable, secure future society, and that is good for the whole nation.
Okay, I want to hear some more questions. I think we've got a microphone down there. Tell us your name and go ahead with your question.
Hi, my name's Sarah. This question, I'm rewinding slightly and wanting to go back to the panel's conversation about conservatism. Now, as a diehard progressive, I thought what you were saying about conservatism and preserving what we have that works and reforming what doesn't is actually a really wonderful thing. But I would suggest to you that what we have in Australia, by your own standards and your own definition, at least what is perceived by the public, is not good conservatism. So I would really wonder how you see the role of conservatism as it exists in Australia in the future reforms of this country.
Okay, well, Bernard wants to jump in. I'll then go to Wyatt. Go ahead, Bernard. Go ahead.
Look, rule of law developed over 200 years. A lot, Magna Carta, this is the 800th anniversary of the famous challenge to the English king by the barons. And we developed rule of law. That's a conservative base to how we should all operate. There is a rule of law, that is, all of the things that constitute our democracy. That's a conservative heritage. So the word conservative isn't a sort of an evil or a bad word. It's our conservative values that are being twisted and turned at the moment in the name of terrorism. So we get metadata now because there happen to be some terrorists around. We get all those conservative original root values we have that our forebears fought for and died, corrupted by, one-time, two-time politicians who want to change things to suit themselves. And so don't say conservative values are themselves innately wrong. They're not. There are rules of law that we've had for years. There's habeas corpus, there's a right to silence when you're accused. I've just finished a 3-week trial in front of jury. Right? That's an ancient right. We all have to be judged by our peers. Things are going wrong. To save money, no one over 60 these days is on a jury. So a 70-year-old person charged doesn't have his or her peers. There are many issues are being eroded in rule of law.
You say no one under 60?
Yeah, very rarely do you get anyone over 60 on a jury these days, let alone over 70. Sometimes you might think people that age get a bit of wisdom. School teachers, nurses are exempt. There are many issues around rule of law that have been cut off in the name of economy and efficiency, education. My daughter's in the arts in the Sydney Opera House, and they are just squirming at the moment over the management of the arts under George Brandis. There are so many issues.
Okay, well, hear from Wyatt, and then we'll come to Van.
Thanks. I think it's great that as a progressive you said that there's elements of conservative ideology that you can understand. And I would also argue that...
Let's get that microphone a bit closer.
I would also argue that on the progressive side, you have people who call themselves progressive that have become populist. And at the beginning I was talking about the nature of the political debate in our country and how in a different media environment we respond with really cheap political lines and slogans and all of this. And I don't think it matters whether you're conservative or progressive. If you are prepared to have those convictions and stand up against something that is unpopular, whether it's conservative or a progressive idea, that is the real test of a politician in my mind. And I would argue that the values of conservatism and liberalism are what we need for our country, and I think a true progressive would argue that their values are what we need for the country, and we should have that contest of ideas. Where we let ourselves down, whether we're on the left or the right, is when we replace those values and those philosophy with populism. Because as a politician, it's really easy. I can stand up here and I can promise you everything you want. You know, I could say, I think that we should give you absolutely everything you want in every element and we'll probably win every election. But it doesn't actually serve the country. It doesn't serve a purpose. So I don't think there's anything wrong with the ideology, and I don't intend on defending that quite strongly.
So,
and I would say
Wyatt,
let's not
can I just
engage
interrupt you
populism.
just for one moment?
Yeah.
Do you think your cabinet has the right balance between conservatism and liberalism?
Well, in any political party, you are going to have that spectrum, and I obviously sit. Look, I mean, let's be honest. I mean, I obviously sit on the socially progressive. You would say that. I'd say socially contemporary liberal and economically conservative, and of course, I'd like to see more of that in the cabinet.
So does that mean no?
Well, it just means that my worldview is not the dominant representation in the party,
Okay.
and but that can change over time, of course.
Okay, Van.
Well, it's interesting to hear this impassioned defence of the rule of law as a tenet of conservatism, given the fact that it is a legal right to seek asylum in this country. It is a legal right to seek asylum in Australia. It is a legal right to be a refugee. And it's also interesting to hear a repudiation of populism in the face of two political parties that are denying refugees their legal right to seek asylum in Australia. That is very fascinating. And are there good things about conservatism? Yes, there are. Conservatism was better than feudalism. Feudalism was better than tyranny. Does that mean that it's an ideology for now and for the future? Well, the corporate rights that you've passionately defended of the mining industry are killing the planet. The future is not a conservative future. The future is a future of looking at land use and looking at a collectivisation of property and respecting Indigenous wisdom around land use. The values that you defend as the core of your ideology, liberal or conservative, are the values that displaced Indigenous Australians from their land. And we are still living in the consequences of that decision.
I'll pick you up on one thing, collectivisation of property. Is that what you said?
Well, I think if we look...
They tried that out in the Soviet Union. It didn't work so well.
Oh, yeah, I'm saying that if we look at... I'm specifically looking at land, and I'm specifically looking at things like land use. And I think we all know that allowing the mining barons to take the sovereign wealth of this nation into private hands has been a disaster. If we look at the comparative example of Norway and what they did with their oil reserves, you have a system in Norway where sovereign wealth has been able to pay for free healthcare and pay for free education and pay for pensions and pay for a universal access to society.
Okay, all right, okay. Nicely dodged.
I'll leave the...
And I don't think you're defending communism by supporting Norway. It's a social democratic country.
I didn't call you a communist. I was just asking a question about collectivisation of land.
On the last bit, I would just say, as a liberal, I would think that you would better know how to run and manage your land than a government ever will, and let's leave it in your hands. But on asylum seekers, I think this is really...
Climate change is real,
Okay, that's great. Well done. I think on a real point, because you brought up a really serious issue, and it is something I am deeply passionate about, and I've invested a lot of time in actually going and finding out about this. On border security, I have said for a long time before my party said this, that we should radically increase the refugee intake as a country because we are a wealthy country and we have the ability to look after the most vulnerable people from across the globe. But on how they come here, there is something incredibly tragic when your country develops a set of policies or a lack of policies where 1,200 people have drowned at sea. And I've been up with our Defence Force personnel and I've been out on those boats. And when you talk to soldiers who have picked dead children out of the water, you very quickly realise that it is not a humane thing as a nation to have a set of policies where people pay tens of thousands of dollars to a people smuggler to risk their life in the most evil trade and often die in that process. And on detention, the last thing I ever want to see is people in detention centres, and particularly children in detention centres. And in 2007, when we left government, there was 0 children in detention centres. And when we came back to government, there were thousands of children in detention centres. So in my mind, if you do have that process, which we saw under the former government, where you have thousands of children in detention centres, and over 1,000 people drowning at sea, that is not a humane thing. And if you get those policies right and you destroy that people smuggling model, you can then do things like double the refugee intake or even go further.
Okay.
And I've argued for that
No,
since
Van,
before.
And
anyone
that
came
hasn't
up.
happened. It hasn't happened.
I'm
It has. We have increased the refugee
I'm gonna
intake
bring
from
in Larissa to
13,000.
respond to
Let me
that.
just, because this is important. We have increased the refugee intake from 13,750 to over 18,000 already. I want us to go further. And I mean, this is a result of our policies.
Okay,
We
all
can
right.
do that.
Thank you. Let's hear from Larissa Waters on
Thank
this.
you. Look, we have got so far to go on asylum seeker policy in this country when we refer to people by number rather than by name, when we continue to lock up women and children in offshore detention centres where we're now finding out they're being sexually abused and trading shower time for sexual favours. It's absolutely barbaric, and spending an awful lot of taxpayer money just to keep those just inhumane torture centres open. Of course, we don't want to see people dying on the high seas, but simply turning them around and making it somebody else's problem just because they're not in Australian territorial waters does not make them safe. It does not help them. It does not uphold our international obligations.
Are you talking about now a policy which appears to be becoming bipartisan? So both
And this is the tragedy
as
of it. We've seen this.
The Labor Party conference is about to endorse in some way, shape or form boat turnbacks.
Indeed, and I can't believe it's come to this, that, you talk about the need for bipartisanship. Well, at the moment, it's just Bill Shorten backing Tony Abbott's horrific cruelty to refugees, and I don't think that's what Australians want.
Okay.
I think what we need to do, if you just wouldn't mind me finishing this point, Tony, what we need to do is properly resource those UNHCR processing centres, because at the moment, people can wait between 15 and 20 years in those camps where they don't have any entitlement to healthcare and they don't have any entitlement to send their kids to school. They are sitting there. Is there any wonder that there is then an incentive to get on a boat?
Okay.
That's the way you take the incentive away, is to speed up that processing time and then process people onshore, bring them into the community, do your basic security checks, but then let them work, let them become members of our community. We are a multicultural country and it has behoved us so well.
Okay, Larissa, I'm just going to ask that we speed up our answers a little bit so that we get to more questions. I'll take the next question from up the back, if we can get a microphone up there. But before we go to that, Tim Wilson, you were listening to that. I just want to get your response.
Well, firstly, I need to correct something Van said before. The reason that Aboriginal people had their land taken from had nothing to do with liberalism or conservatism. It was actually the denial of those principles and recognising them as human beings by early settlers. And that is one of the issues that I'm most passionate about. They've been doing a lot of work as Human Rights Commissioner to address that, not just to have land, but also the freedom to be able to exercise it and make sure that they can economically develop it if they so choose to do so. And the future of property isn't based on collective, it's based on what the owners decide they want to do with it, and that can vary. In terms of asylum seeker policy, I've worked in this area and gone into detention centres and spoken to families and dealt with the horrific human consequences, did interviews for the Children in Detention report that was released earlier this year. And the one thing I've learned is it's easy to sloganeer about asylum seekers. There is no consequence-free public policy solution. And I don't say that to advocate any policy position at all. It's horrific. There are human consequences no matter what policy position you take. The question is, are you making the policy based on minimising the human consequences? And there is no easy answer to that.
Let me just ask you one just a quick follow-up to that. Once you've actually made the decision to turn back boats, but you still have a number of people in offshore detention centres, should there automatically be a time limit when the boats are no longer coming on how long you can keep people effectively imprisoned?
There should be a time limit in order to establish somebody's identity, to establish somebody's health and their security, and that is not in question. I don't think
So we know all of these things about all of those people, so should they be let out now?
Well, those people those on offshore are being processed by those governments, and do I think they should do it as quickly as humanly possible without reservation? Because one of the things, if you've seen asylum seekers in detention centres, whether they're going to be granted refugee status or not, is the dehabitualisation of somebody's life. And this happens to everybody. If you are not engaged in a habit within life, you forget the basic learnings of life. Getting up at a certain hour, taking responsibility, cooking for yourself, cleaning for yourself, and it almost makes it impossible for somebody to then go on and live a normal life without having to go the process that we all take about 18 years to learn for ourselves.
Just on that issue of time limits very quickly, we moved an amendment to, look, we want to end offshore detention, but unfortunately we don't have anybody agreeing with us in the Parliament on that. So we moved some amendments to the latest hideous migration law to try to put a time limit on offshore detention and to say once those basic checks have been undertaken, for God's sake, do it within 3 months at the very latest. Nobody voted with us on that. It was the Greens, again, voting for that, and everybody else filed in if they bothered to show up for the vote and sat on the other side of the chamber.
Okay, all right. Let's go to a question up the back, and there are lots of questions in the middle on that side, probably on that side as well. We should get a microphone over to that side because you're in the dark. I can hardly see you, but I can see some arms up, so we'll try and go to that side next. So, go ahead, up the back.
Funnily enough, my question's about Labor and their backflip on the embracing the stopping the boats policy. What do you think that means for both Labor and the Liberal Party in the next election? How does that play out politically with Labor now embracing the Liberal Party stance? Okay, yep. I'll start with Bernard because we haven't heard from him for a while, and then I'll go to Van.
Well, look, what it means is that you've got this improper bipartisanship that creates a convenient method of putting the issue aside for the next election, shelving the issue, and that's principally what's happening. So that issue is taken away from, in many respects, to the minds of the voters. It's a political device to get a hot potato out of this time, the Labor Party room, and off the table. It's an off-the-table tactic for sure. And it's up to you to determine whether that's important in how you vote at the next election.
Van.
Yeah, I think we're in a really depressing period of our history. And the reality is I'd love to agree with Larissa that Australians don't want to see what's happening to asylum seekers, but unfortunately, that's what's happening now. But unfortunately, I have to deal with the reality that your opinion and my opinion are not the opinion of the majority of Australians. An Essential poll that was done in April said that 78% of Australians either thought the current refugee policy was adequate or not tough enough. And that's the reality that we're living in. Labor are doing what all politicians do and go where the votes are. And the votes are in marginal seats where the issue of refugees and national security have been conflated by a popular sentiment that is effectively racist. That brown people, whether they throw bombs or seek help, are, the enemy. And that is a belief that has taken hold in parts of the electorate, and they are parts of the electorate that direct their votes towards appeals to national security.
Okay, Wyatt.
I mean, that is like so deeply...
Microphone.
That is so deeply offensive because that is not at all the reality. As I said, the result of our policies mean that there are over 1,000 children that are no longer in detention centres. We've been able to increase the refugee intake and take more refugees as a country and hopefully continue to do that. And for me, that is a humanitarian standpoint. And it's an easy thing to say what you just said, but having been on the ships with the sailors, they thank you for those policies because they are not pulling children out of the ocean. And I can't understand why you can argue a set of policies that saw that is a humanitarian thing to do. I can't understand
I'm not arguing for those policies. I believe in Malcolm Fraser, Whitlam, bipartisan
increasing the refugee intake. That's what we're doing.
Of the increasing humanitarian intake. The difference, Wyatt, is you're a member of the ruling government and you're in a position to legislate around that. You're in a position to legislate for massive expansion.
Personally in a position to...
I'm not a member of the executive, but I have argued publicly for a long time, for years now, that we should increase the refugee intake as our country. All right. And we've done that.
Okay, we've got some questions. I'd like to get to as many as possible. Gentleman very patiently waiting down the front here, standing up. We'll get a microphone to him. And then we'll go to a question over this side in the middle. Thank you very much. Go ahead.
My name's Yilla. I'm a Githable and Arakable tribal elder. And my major concern is the politics that is at hand before us as a race of peoples in this country. We are the original peoples. I take offence to being called an Aboriginal man because I'm not. I'm original. When you put AB before the word original, you change my status. And the government, in its bastardry and its political terrorism, is pushing what I call a Trojan horse in regards to recognising us in the Constitution. And I want to know the legal mandate from the Commonwealth and from the federal Parliament and its states and its territories, and what our legal status will be in this country if we are recognised. I say this because we do not trust the government because of the history that we've had with it. We do not trust the Commonwealth because of the history that we've had with it. It is not nice. It is a human tragedy. I say this. And when people stay silent in the corridors of power and say nothing, they help that process. So I'm asking the question here now. What is the legal mandate for the Commonwealth, for the federal government and the states and its territories? And at the end of the day, if they get us into the Constitution, what will our legal status be? Because I know that once we come into a legal status with the government, we are no more as a peoples in this country. And it's called ethnic cleansing.
Okay, well, let's. Who wants to start us off on this? You want to start off?
Well, the authority of the Commonwealth of Australia came from a mixture of an Act of Parliament of the British Parliament and also of the states that existed, or then colonies in the states existed, and the people that voted in favour of a unifying constitution for them. And I acknowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people weren't part of that.
I'll get you to keep that microphone if you can. You still got the microphone? Just keep it for a minute. Go ahead.
In answer to the question of what your legal status will be, that is what everybody is trying to determine as part of this discussion around recognition of Aboriginal or original people, as you would like to be called, in the Constitution, and whether you should be recognised in the Constitution specifically as a peoples. And so while I can appreciate the passion, I think the intention from those advocating for it, and that includes many people who are original peoples, is for there to be a recognition specifically of original peoples as original peoples in the Constitution to avoid the idea that there shouldn't be proper acknowledgement of that.
Okay, I just want to go back to you while you've got the microphone to ask you why you think it's a Trojan horse. Why do you think that?
Well, I look at the native title process and the legal documents within it and its legal intent, and it gave us bugger all. It gave us nothing. Therefore, it was a fraudulent conveyance of a legal process. And I've got to wonder whether that is the same case here with this recognition into the Constitution. And if it is a Trojan horse, we know what happened to Troy. It was destroyed. And I do not desire to go away quietly into the darkness of what is before us.
And you shouldn't have to.
No.
Yeah.
And I asked the question of the Human Rights Commission, Tim Wilson, can the Human Rights Commission of Australia or the International Human Rights sit in and watch the legal process in regards to the drafting of such a legal document that affects us as a race of people?
Okay,
let's. It doesn't affect anybody.
Can I actually?
Thank you for that. We'll throw that to Tim and then the rest of the panel.
I'll give a short answer, which is the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner Mick Gooder is a very active participant both publicly and privately in this process. But the key thing, and I'm not advocating for this position, but is Noel Pearson's model is designed around making sure that there is a specific body to make sure that Aboriginal peoples have a voice into the federal parliament, particularly with relation to laws that affect them.
But they're not the full representation of all the tribal structures across the country.
Okay.
And you've got over 220 tribes to 300 tribes who don't even recognise Noel Pearson because he has a financial joinder to the government.
Okay, all right. Let's hear from Larissa and then
Thank
Bernard.
you. Firstly, it's lovely to see you again. I remember watching you speak at the Bentley blockade about 18 months ago, where you spoke passionately about protecting our land. So thank you for once again sharing your views so articulately and eloquently.
Larissa, the Greens support the Recognise campaign, don't they?
Look, we do, but I think you've made some excellent points. I think it would be foolish for any of us to think that Indigenous people speak with one voice. And the danger of the native title process is that, as I understand it, it puts an awful lot of power into representative bodies. And I've met with a number of traditional owners who say, look, these people don't speak for my country. I'm feeling like I'm not even part of this process. It's an incredibly distressing area, and I think you're right, our systems so far have failed. The Native Title Act was a creature of white Parliament. It was a Prime Minister Howard legislation at the time. It wasn't full land rights. It was the poor cousin, if you like, and that's not appropriate. We need a treaty in this country with our First People.
Yes. Okay. Yes. I'm going to... Bernard's been an Attorney General of the ACT, so let's hear from him.
Well, that's exactly what you need. The original peoples have to rewrite history. Look at the history of New Zealand. You haven't got this same tension because the British were forced, by force, mind you, to sit down and write a treaty with the Indigenous inhabitants. And a treaty was written then that developed the way New Zealand has developed. It didn't happen here. Your peoples were just subjugated. And what you've got to do now, from your side too, as Larissa was saying, you've got to somehow rewrite history. I don't know if you can't get into a time machine and bring the original leaders back, even if you could convoke all of them, but somehow or other, your peoples have to rewrite history and reach a treaty position now with the people who are going to guide this process. But I agree, it shouldn't be patronised. It's speaking from the original voice, throwing yourself back to the original voice that's going to produce the treaty that's been a long, long time coming for your people.
Okay, I'm going to go to Wyatt. Now, Wyatt, having spoken to a number of Indigenous leaders on this subject, leaders of the original people, we can say, I know that the idea of a treaty is not dead by any means. There is a strong strain of thought here that the Recognise campaign should go ahead, the constitutional recognition should go ahead, and then a treaty on top of that. Is that something that you, as a kind of future politician, maybe a future cabinet minister, might actually support?
Well, I mean, the first question I would say, is that what you would support? Is that what you'd like to see?
I would like to see good consciousness in dialogue with the original peoples, in good consciousness, in good heart, and in truth. Because at the present moment, you know, the scenario I come up with, or to give you an idea what it is like for us as tribal peoples in our respected areas, is that when you go into the when you're walking through your council and through your town, you see a town park and you see how beautiful it is, and that the tree that's in that park has a huge and a great life expectancy because its roots are still in the ground. We find that with the Constitution, they're going to uproot us spiritually and put us in a pot plant and restrict. We're still like that in the park. We do not want to be uprooted from our ancestry, from our spirituality, or from our cultural beliefs, and to be put into a pot plant and be constricted to the ideals that don't sit right with us.
Okay, let's hear Wyatt on that.
Yeah,
and,
I mean,
might hand your microphone over to that side now, sir. Thank you very much.
I mean, this is my point. I think we should ask the Indigenous community, not have politicians directing it. We said that the treaty is an option up here, but I think if we were to go down that path as a country, it would be something where we seriously have to consult with people, and I'm open-minded always, but that is, I think even on Indigenous recognition, it is going to be a big moment for our country to achieve consensus about what that looks like and to be able to achieve that change. And I think these things have to be done incrementally in a way that they bring the community with you, because if it looks like for a second it's politicians directing it or driving it, I think it fails straight away.
Okay, Van.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I agree with that. It's about Indigenous control of Indigenous affairs, and that comes through two ways. One, through a treaty and through the recognition and negotiation of a treaty, but also through reparations. We are all on Aboriginal land, and not many of us are paying the rent. And the reality is there has to be a recognition that Indigenous inequality is also driven by the economic reality of disadvantage, and it's repairing economic disadvantage, which is one of the most powerful contributions we can make to a restitution to Aboriginal people.
Okay, now I promised to go to a question over this side. Has someone got a microphone? Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, my name is Stephen, and I've got a question for the entire panel. Are the major political parties, as they are made up these days, a hindrance to the great reforms from the issues that we've talked about today? Is there room for a third party to rise up and be, as the Democrats used to call them, the ones who kept the bastards honest?
Okay, good question. Hey, Bernard, you've been around for a while.
Yeah, well, look...
In fact, you actually formed your own party to take over the ACT government.
Bob Hawke, when he was Prime Minister, decided to impose self-government on the Australian Capital Territory. A lot of people didn't want it because they were on the federal teat, and there was a big debate about it. But both of the major parties saw it as an opportunity to get extra power, extra place in the parliamentary scheme of events, and we formed our own independent party. We called it the Residents' Rally for Canberra. We got 1 seat less than Labor and the same number of seats as the Liberal Party. And I'm the first non-conservative, non-socialist person ever to be an Attorney General in this country. And we got power for 3 years, and at the end of the 3 years, the Labor and Liberal parties took out joint newspaper ads to tell the people they couldn't trust us. They jointly managed an electoral campaign to defeat us and drive us out of government. It is very, very hard to set up a third force in this country. The Democrats got run over by us because their policies was to stand on the sidelines and, quote, as you just said, keep the bastards honest. Who wants to stand on the sidelines? You get in there and get the bastards, which we did for 3 years.
Okay, now I would imagine that Larissa would say we are the third force in politics. Why aren't people thinking about you in the way that they thought about the Democrats as those that keep the bastards honest?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. We're certainly not bastards, at least I don't think we are. And I think you're right, Bernard, we've got to do more than keep them honest, because I don't want to hold Tony Abbott to his promises, because I don't think that his promises, the ones that he does keep, are actually good for the nation. I think we need to replace them. I think we need to modernise our entire parliament, and I think we need some generational change. We need some more evidence-based policy making. That might sound a bit boring, but I certainly agree with Wyatt that there's been far too much populism and far too much cheap point scoring against the other guy, and you know, that's pathetic. We get paid quite well to do a really important job, and I think we owe it to people to put the work in, to get across what the expert evidence says, to get across what the science says, to listen to what the community wants, and then reflect those views. And you know, it wouldn't hurt to actually lead the debate sometimes. Instead, we seem to be like totally out of touch with most of the community on key issues. Look at equal marriage. The Parliament is like the last body to get that that's what the Australian people want. And I think that's a real shame. I think we should be leading some of these debates. And I guess it goes back to asylum seeker policy as one particular example. And Van, you quoted that horrific statistic where 78% of Australians think that we should be even more horrible to refugees and take fewer of them. I think that's because, and it's not for want of the Greens trying, that there's not been a strong, well-broadcast challenge to the Abbott rhetoric that refugees are somehow synonymous with danger, with fear. Some of them might be terrorists. I think people are sadly believing what they hear because they don't hear a strong voice saying, for God's sake, these are human beings. They're just like you and me. They just want to have a safe start and be able to contribute to a society. So, yes, I think I'd like to think we are the third force, but it is very difficult for us to get our voice heard, particularly when Tony keeps telling me to have brief answers.
Okay, I'm going to come to...
Case in point.
I'll come to...
Thank you for your question, though.
I'll come to Tim on that. Let's get a microphone over to this side of the room now. Now, I've got to ask the room this, because I know some of you have things to go to, but we've been told we can go for an extra half an hour. If you'd like that, we will. You want to keep going? Okay. Otherwise, we're nearly about to wind up. But if you want to keep going for another half an hour, we will. Okay, Tim.
Well, Australia already has a third political force. It also has a fourth political force. We have the Liberal, Labor, National and Greens parties all heavily represented, as well as other parties like, well, it's not what it used to be, but the Palmer Party. So you can set up new political parties, but I accept the broad criticism that came from over here before.
I think it's Jackie Lambie connection.
When we have all of those different things. But I would say that most people think about politics and political philosophy and where they sit within the political framework on economic and social issues. And I think that's an important analysis, but it's not the end of the analysis. Because the reality is the vast bulk of the Australian people are culturally and institutionally conservative. And then they differ on economic and social policy. And I would argue that even the Democrats were culturally and institutionally a conservative political party, but had different views on economic and social policy or environmental policy. And this isn't a criticism, but the one bit of analysis that I would say is that the Greens are probably the least economically least culturally and institutionally conservative political party that has existed in mainstream politics. And I think that is a very interesting, and that is a very interesting development in Australian political history, and means it defines itself very differently from existing parties that have worked within the structures. And you might take that as a compliment.
I do, given the huge inequity between rich and poor that's getting worse. Clearly, our current economic system is not working.
With respect, I think you've just missed my point. There's a difference between... the point is around cultural conservatism and progressive cultural attitudes and institutions like the structure of our democracy.
Tim, just to clarify...
I'm just saying that the Greens are a culturally and institutionally progressive party.
Sure. Just to clarify your point, are you essentially saying there is no way an Australian government would ever put... the Australian public would ever put a Greens government in place at a national level?
I'm not trying to predict the future. I'm just trying to say there is a substantial difference, and you've taken as a compliment, about Greens being a culturally and institutionally progressive party.
Okay.
And that is quite different.
Okay. All right. A question from this side.
Can we answer that one?
Yeah, sorry,
that is
go ahead,
actually,
of course you can.
The one person in a major political party.
Yeah.
Look, I think the major political parties have to change. And there is a difference between a third force in Australian politics and a force in Australian politics that is either populist or ideologically 100% pure. It's different to that third force that you're talking about. If you want a third force, you've got one in Palmer United at one stage. I don't think that's what we need. In terms of democratising the major political parties, I think they fail to achieve the things that we're talking about when your only path to Parliament is through a faction or through a union or through some sort of other organisation. Now, I was elected in pretty unlikely circumstances, and it's because, at least in Queensland with my party, it is deeply, deeply democratic. So if you're a local and you're a member, you vote. It's the same as a US-style primary. And I think if we could achieve that for my party across the country, and for the Labor Party, that would be a very big step. But if you could do that, I think you would have a party, major parties that are more representative of the Australian people and can achieve the stuff that we're talking about, because they're not, beholden to some other interest to keep their seat in Parliament. And the other point that, I would just, really make again is that it is very easy to be absolutely pure and say that my worldview is the only right view out there. And if people don't agree with me, they're wrong. I think there's something in being a major political party. And Tony, you talked about the makeup of the cabinet. I like the fact that I can get up in the party room and I say, it's not my job to toe the party line, it's my job to create it. And I get up in the party room, and if my convictions are strong enough, if my argument is strong enough, I can convince my colleagues to adopt a policy. If it's not, it won't. And I'm not the smartest person in the room.
Just a thought. We were talking about the Democrats earlier. Yeah. A lot of people would be too young to even know about them, but they were formed by...
They were this thing that happened, and it was all bad.
They were formed by a Liberal who defected, Don Chipp, who decided, there's no way I can ever get my cabinet to think like I think about a whole range of issues. So I'm actually going to set up a new party to, quote unquote, keep the bastards honest. Yeah. Ever crossed your mind?
I mean, there is something in Don Chipp. I think it is pretty amazing character, but it is not. As I said, I think there's room for change inside the major political parties, and I'm deeply optimistic about that. I think it's so easy to be cynical about politics, and some mornings I wake up and I think, why the hell am I doing this job? But
so do you see yourself like a one-man people's revolution?
No, I don't. I don't, because there are people like me in the party. And that's what is so exciting. And I can tell you,
Can
know,
you
it
name
might
them?
not be
Can
perfect
you name
now.
them
I
here?
mean, I could,
Or
I
would
could
you be
think of a
subject
few.
to a 10-year jail
I
sentence?
think you could think of a few too, mate. But I would say...
Are they allowed on Q&A?
I would say... I would actually say, you know, if I just wanted to be an independent and say, I'm the smartest bloke in the country, everyone should agree with me, then you'd run as an independent. But I think there is something when I can sit down with my colleagues who I disagree with and we can workshop a policy. Because if you look at where the big policy failures have come as a country, it has been when you've had an inability to workshop those ideas, both internally within a political party, you know, when you have one person picking it, or when the parliament hasn't had the opportunity to say, how do we come to an agreement? And the example that I gave you before was me and Ed Husick, the Labor MP. On that policy space, this is economic policy, creating economic policy. We are going to disagree from time to time. But the fact that we can sit down together and say, well, where can we agree? How can we workshop that? I think shows that there is hope in the major political parties because they form government. And that's where you can make the real change.
Now, Van wants to get in on this, and I'm going to go to a question after that.
Yeah, because for me, like, the third force is actually the other force, and that's us. Like, I think one of the great illusions and that people perpetuate is this idea that, you know, we have to have a leadership to make decisions for us. This is a democracy. And... you know, it's interesting to hear Tim say that, you know, Australians are inherently conservative. I think Australians are inherently diverse because they're citizens within a democracy. If we were inherently, Tim, let me speak. If we were inherently anything, governments would not change. You know, we change our votes, we change our positions on things, we evolve through the conversations we have on one another. Marriage equality is one example. The issue of women in the workplace, of equal pay, of abortion rights, all of these were things that were fought for by activists leading the people. People who came from the community to lead the community, and politicians responded in kind. 90% of Australians in a country where abortion used to be illegal, and it still technically is in New South Wales, support a woman's full legal right to choose. And that was an argument that was won in the community through leadership of the community. And expecting a political party, whether it's the Liberal Party, the Labor Party, or the Greens, to make decisions for you, in a democracy, they're our servants. They serve us. They serve the continuing demands of an evolving conversation that takes into account all kinds of different political viewpoints. You and I actually have a lot of common ground on issues around particularly the surveillance state. I mean, I read articles by you and I go, I agree with Tim. People shouldn't be under surveillance. There shouldn't be this invasion into the private sphere and the domestic sphere. Am I a conservative? Hell no. When it comes to property rights, you and I can fight it out until there's blood on the floor, because that's the privilege of a democracy.
Okay, let's hear from Tim. Briefly, Tim, and we'll go to our next question.
I like being told not to say anything before I've even said it.
It's a preemptive strike, mate.
Sorry?
You know
no, trust me, I was waiting. I was just waiting very patiently. And you're absolutely right. There is common ground between different political forces. I didn't say that all Australians were inherently conservative. What I said was the majority of Australians are institutionally and culturally conservative. And I think that is very true. And that is the binding nature of most political parties in this country. And that is just an observation around the issues. But I think we should avoid jumping to sort of the populism of many of these discussions, because all of the issues of injustice that some people want to address and I want to address are very important, but the only way you can advance them in addressing what we call informal equality, which is equality between citizens and a more just society, is to preserve and protect formal equality and the institutions like rule of law, like the structures of our democracy, and like human rights for all equally, in order to do so. Because when you compromise formal equality to advance informal equality, you're picking citizens and deciding who will win and who will not, rather than saying everybody should have the best chance to live their life in our society.
Okay, let's hear from, I think we said this side of the room. I've got a microphone floating around somewhere. Go ahead.
G'day, everyone. It's on?
Yep.
Sorry, guys. G'day, everyone. We don't have a Labor... My name's Ben. We don't have anyone...
G'day, Ben.
Thank you. We don't have a Labor politician on the panel, but I thought this question might be worth asking anyway.
They're all in the conference.
yeah.
They have their own festival.
It's not as cool as this one, I might add.
They don't call it Splendour, and it's probably not as splendid.
recent polls, I believe, have shown that Labor have been consolidating their position in terms of two-party preferred polling. But at the same time, we've got an interesting situation where Bill Shorten, as a leader, is actually declining to some of the lowest levels that he's experienced. And so my question is, when does enough become enough in terms of Bill Shorten being the opposition leader?
Okay, that is a question I did anticipate. Bernard, let's hear from you.
Yeah, look, you know, my whole take on all of this is that this country needs honest, moral leadership, and it's not there. And the somersaults that Bill's doing now raise questions about leadership, fundamental questions about leadership on the moral question of this, in this particular instance, refugees. If Tim is right, and I suspect he's right about the innate conservatism and the prudence of the electorate, a relatively prudent electorate will almost certainly follow strong moral leadership. It's just not been here.
But if Van is right, what he's essentially doing is following where most of the votes will be.
Well, that's like water. It just dribbles anywhere. We don't have leadership.
Van.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to believe that it was about strong moral leadership. And if it was, we'd have a very different government to the one that we have. If it was about strong moral leadership, Tony Abbott would not be the Prime Minister of this country. You cannot say the things that he has said about women and claim that you're in a position of strong moral leadership. I mean, it is very difficult to discuss the Labor Party without a Labor Party representative here. I think that, you know, it's one of the things that everybody...
Now, we can discuss it, they just won't get their say.
Yeah, they won't get their say, but also no one here is privy to the internal dynamics of what's going on in the Labor Party, as, you know, as no one apart from Larissa is necessarily privy to what's going on in the Greens leadership. I mean, for me, it's kind of an alarming moment in Australian history where after all of this time and all of this effort, we're still looking at three parties all led by white guys. That's kind of depressing. And certainly, I think that the Labor Party adopting the 50% quota in terms of their gender representation and looking at their internal democracy in terms of gender is a really interesting move and may yet lead to a woman candidate at some point. Probably Tanya Plibersek, who apparently, if you read the polls I do, is the single most popular politician in the country.
All right, let's hear from Wyatt. Would it be in your interest for the Liberal Party to keep Bill Shorten in place for as long as possible?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be happy if they did, but I don't...
Microphone.
I'd be happy if they did, but I don't, you know, I'm not interested in just sticking the knife into the Labor Party. I think we see enough of that already. All I would say about Bill is I don't know what he stands for. You know, I don't know what he believes in, and that goes back to my point about where politics is at.
And Tim, do you want to get in on this one?
No.
Okay, we'll go to another question. Let's go into the middle now. We'll get a question from the middle. Let's grab one of those questioners there. There's a lot of very anxious people there. Go ahead. Yes, we need questions from women. Very good.
Hi, I'm Ali, and my question is related to women in Parliament. I think it was Larissa or Wyatt that asked the question why there weren't more women running for member positions. And I'd have to say that most of us who are educated and who have an opinion, who have a voice, who are innovators of change and instigators of change, actually are disenchanted and work in the private sector. You know, myself, a sustainability economics, my friend who's a criminal psychologist, who's also disenchanted with the mental health system, so now is working in the education sector. So I guess that's the answer, and I think, you know, Bernard said it beautifully, there's no moral leadership, there's no... we have no one to aspire to. We feel like, what is the point? There's so much change to make. It's overwhelming.
Do you think that would change if there were more women in positions of leadership?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We've got an emotional thought process as well as a rational thought process. I'm not taking anything away from men. I think an equal balance, and Denmark is a great example of that. Where there's equality in pay, equality in parliament, and a wonderfully run economy, and people are happy. Their main resource is people, and I think we have a very big opportunity in this country. I don't see how it's going to happen at the moment, where we've got 95% of our energy being used in fossil fuels and trying to get to the 30% that the rest of the world is just a minefield.
Okay, let's stick with the
Sorry,
question.
I'm getting off track.
Let's stick with the question about women. I'll go to Larissa.
Look, firstly, Ali, you seem like just the sort of person that should be in our parliament. You speak beautifully and you've clearly got strong convictions, so well done in speaking out today. And please don't discount it. It's so easy to look at the system and be disheartened. I get it. I feel that way every day, waking up in Canberra and facing the nastiness and the blokiness is challenging, but you've got to be in it to change it. And, you know, strong women like you who are bright and well-spoken and care deeply about the planet, that's exactly the sort of person we need in the parliament.
Yeah. And Van, let's hear from you.
Well, I think, you know, left or right, if you're a, you know, politically engaged woman and you've seen the treatment of A, Julia Gillard and B, Peter Credlin, you would seriously evaluate whether or Larissa Waters and the ridiculous harassment that Larissa gets, or that women in the media like me get, where you're constantly addressed on the way you look and who you may or may not fuck, as if they're the only two things that are important about being a woman in public life. I can imagine that it would be very dissuading, but the way to get through that is actually solidarity amongst women, which is why for all the political battles that, you know, like I could have with members of the Liberal Party or even women in the National Party, if they're women, you support them. Women who back women win. And forming communities of women, good old style 1970s autonomous women's organising is the way that you keep the bastards away.
Okay, in terms of solidarity for women, I see there's another woman with her hand up just in front of you. Could you pass that microphone to her?
Hello, I'm Angie. I wanted to talk about age of entitlement, or to ask how we can change
I just answer
that.
the other one first? Can I answer the women question? Because I think that is important.
Okay, Angie.
I mean, it's just something
Angie,
I feel
hold your microphone.
It is something, and it will come to that. But I mean,
excluded
I do feel
Wyatt because he wasn't a woman. That was quite wrong.
I know. I think this goes back to my first point, and this is something I've thought an enormous amount about. If we democratise the major political parties, that will help enormously. Because, to be perfectly honest, there is a boys' club. There is a boys' club that exists in how we get people into Parliament. And I think that we have to, if you democratise it, that immediately gives us pretty much a level playing field. Then the major political parties have to go out of their way to support female candidates, and particularly female candidates with families and young families. We have to go out of our way to support them and find them. The one thing that I would argue against, and we'll have a disagreement about this, but I feel strongly about this, the story of our democracy is that anybody from anywhere can become anything. That is the most powerful story in our democracy. And I know from a personal sense that no one thought I would be in the parliament. But it was a great thing that in our democracy I could find my way there. And I do think the moment you bring in quotas for gender, for age, for ethnicity, you actually kind of destroy that story. Because if you say, as a female, you get more votes than the male sitting next to you because you're a woman, I just find that deeply undemocratic.
Just on that point,
I know people have strong views.
But so's Van. Van first.
Wyatt, if anybody from anywhere can be anything, and our parliament is dominated by white men who own property, you're effectively arguing that white men who own property have more ability and more talent and you are ignoring the fact that structural injustice exists. You know,
I'm actually saying it does exist and we need to do things to change it, but the thing that changes it shouldn't hurt the narrative.
The thing that changes it is not just operating within the status quo and pretending everything's all right. You actually have to put the change in.
I'm not for a second saying everything's all right. I'm saying it's broken. There's a boys' club. It's deeply undemocratic. And we should change those things.
And and voluntary self-regulation has got us exactly to this point where, again, all three of the major political parties have white men leading them.
It did get you all the way to a pretty interesting gender breakdown in the cabinet.
And on the day the cabinet was sworn in, I wrote an opinion piece saying exactly the things that I just said. Yeah. And in this year, in 2015, it is not good enough to have two women in the cabinet. That has to change.
Would you give up your seat to put a woman in?
If she could win the vote of the locals. This is why, for me, we should choose people for Parliament based on the merit of the individual.
Okay.
You know, that we want the best people in Parliament, and we want, and women have we need to give significant support to women to help them get into the parliament. But if you say because you're a woman, you're in the parliament, I think that takes away from it.
But if you're saying it's a merit...
I'm just afraid this is turning into a sort of duet. We'll just want to hear from... make it
I take requests.
Okay, let's hear from Bernard.
I work closely in East Timor with the leadership, with the Prime Minister Chinana Gusmao and the others. And there was a lot of thought about quotas there because it was a deeply male-dominated, misogynist, terrible society with terrible levels of domestic violence. And we introduced, I was involved in a decision to impose quotas as a starting point. Quotas will go in due course, but how do you start the ball rolling? How do you start? And I'm really impressed by Wyatt today. I want to nurture his idealism. I think it's great. But the fact is, the only way you can turn this around after years and years since Federation, the position of women in Parliament, I've got 3 grown daughters, is to have a quota, to do it by quotas, to force it on the boys. That's my view.
Okay. I think we've got a bit of agreement on, at least from some of it, but let's go to a different question.
Why don't we go back to Angie, who's been waiting patiently with the mic.
Yeah. Thanks, Angie. Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask about age of entitlement. I'm a nurse. I am... Our department is...
You get a bigger round of applause than if you say journalist.
Our department is being told to do more with less staff to meet budget cuts. All the staff, all the nurses I know around me are working harder and harder to make sure people are safe with less support, with less funding. Paramedics I know are being stretched to the limit. All the emergency services that I work with are being stretched. We're being told to do more with less. And every single day we are fighting so hard to hold on to our hard-won entitlements. I'm talking about meal breaks. I'm talking about penalty rates that are under attack. I'm talking about safe staffing, and all of that is to keep our community safe. And at the same time, you see Bronwyn Bishop catching a helicopter, you know, and that is just the tip of the iceberg. That's the ones we know. The snouts in trough, at the expense of the community and the people working hard to keep them safe. How do we get the snouts out of the trough and redistribute that money?
Okay, let's go to Larissa first of all.
Thank you, Angie. Excellent question, and thank you for the work that you do. I'm sorry that the health system is being completely butchered with this bizarre notion that some have to tighten belts, but gee, the big end of town don't, and neither to the politicians. I think it is hypocrisy, and I think it contributes to why people hold politicians generally in quite low esteem. So, excellent question. They have unfortunately taken out about $80 billion from health and education federally, much of that's from health. And you know that there was a proposal for a GP co-payment to make people pay to go to the doctor because somehow primary health care is like not a preventative measure, go figure. So the health policy needs a radical turnaround, and the attacks on the universality of Medicare are really disturbing because, you know, we are a proud nation that believes, I thought, in public health care, in good quality public health care, where you should be able to get the medical attention that you need without needing wads of cash. It makes us different from some of the world's other large economies, and I think it makes us a better nation.
So, Larissa, we've had a huge debate on this just in the past week after the New South Wales Premier acknowledging there's not enough money for future health spending, particularly in hospitals, particularly for nurses, says the only way around that is to raise new taxes. He's proposing to put the GST to 15%. I no doubt the Greens don't support that, but where would the money come from otherwise?
Well, thank you. I was coming to that. I think that's your point, Angie. If the age of entitlement is over, why isn't it over for multinational corporations? Why isn't it over for millionaires? Why isn't it over for superannuants who are earning a very healthy package and are able to effectively dodge income tax by putting extra money into their super? Why is it only over for some? And why is it those who can most afford to pay that are actually continue to be let off the hook?
But
so
seriously, we're talking about you know, in the region of $10 to $15 billion a year that would have to be raised just to keep the healthcare system going at the level that it is now. You're not going to get that by taxing multinationals and the range of things you're talking about. Where's the big money going to come from? The question the Labor Party is never able to answer.
Well,
and evidently, to be honest, the Greens have not really got an answer for this either.
Well, I actually do, if you let me have a go. Thank you, Tony. And sorry, but we have...
Oh, I've been interrupting, Wyatt. You get equal opportunity interruptions.
I know, that's true. You do it very well. Keep it up. We've got about $81 billion that we've proposed for revenue raising so far that we've costed through the Parliamentary Budget Office, which is an independent office that we help set up that makes sure politicians can pay for the promises that they make. And there's a series of about 9 proposals now, and I mentioned some of them before. Reforming the super system would raise about, off the top of my head, I think it's about $9 billion. Bringing back the carbon price so that we can tackle climate change and stop paying polluters, but actually make them pay, would raise about $18 billion. Bringing back a mining tax that didn't have inbuilt loopholes in it, fixing those rather than ditching the whole thing, that's about $10 billion. Bringing in a millionaires tax so that people who earn over $1 million pay 50% rather than 45%, and I think actually even the Labor Party put a motion to their conference yesterday to support that. There's a few more
financial services tax, is that one of them?
That's not on the list, but it's something that we'd consider.
Okay.
GST, no. Again, it hits the people who can least afford to pay, and it's the lazy option.
Okay.
Why aren't we looking at fixing those corporate
I'm not interrupting you
tax
for any other
frauds?
reason than to hear a few more voices on this because we're running out of time. So, Wyatt, go ahead.
Yeah.
So GST.
Yeah. Well,
I'm going to come to Van in a minute.
Yeah,
Yes, Van.
but I want to go back to the evidence-based policy. Everywhere we look, we are increasing health budgets. So in my home state of Queensland, we're increasing it by 27% over 4 years. But the reality is, for our country, a long-term challenge. We have an ageing population, and the increase of the demands that we have on the health system are going to be massive. Now, this is not me. This is the Productivity Commission. We're moving as a country from a place where for every person that is not working, there's 7.5 people working. And we're going to hit a point where that's only 2.5. So as a country, how we maintain our health and our education services into the future is going to be a very difficult thing for us to grapple with. It doesn't matter whether you're a Labor politician or a Liberal politician, there is a demographic reality that our country will have to face. Now, the Productivity Commission says, if you were to simply maintain the system we have today, without adding the NDIS, which I think all Australians want to see, without adding, other investment into education or anything else, the next generation of Australians, our generation, are going to pay 21% more tax because we have to. And I think there is a bit of an intergenerational inequity, but that is the reality of an ageing population. It was a great thing as a country. A lot of people had babies after the war, and that's where we're seeing that demand. So we are increasing funding significantly, 27% in my home state. But the demand is vastly outstripping that. And I think, we talked about how politics can be better. I have a cautious optimism about what we've seen in the last few weeks at COAG, where you have leaders of the different states, because obviously hospitals are run by the state governments, where they've come to the table and they've said, we are prepared to admit that there's a problem. Because it's really easy for a politician to say, there is no problem, it'll all be fixed somehow. But there is a massive problem when you've got that demographic change as a country. And for us to put on the table, these are the potential tax options, and hopefully they can come together and achieve something, I think is the sort of politics that we want to see.
So can I just ask you, just on the question of leadership, why is it considered to be good leadership to try and get the states to tell you what to do rather than go to them and argue what should be done and bring them along with you?
Well, ultimately you want both at the table. But there is a reality, as you know. I mean, the Commonwealth government doesn't run hospitals. We don't employ nurses. That's always been done by the state.
I'm talking about the tax arrangements in order to pay for these things. Why did Tony Abbott wait for the Premier of New South Wales to suggest this, not suggest it himself?
Because he promised there wouldn't be one, Tony, because Tony Abbott promised there wouldn't be a GST. So if Mike Baird suggested,
he said, to be precise, I think he said in this term of government.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. That is what he said. But I think it is proper leadership when you have both coming to the table, because we do have a strange system in our country where the states run the hospitals, the states run the schools, and the Commonwealth government tries to fund that through income tax. It's a weird thing. And to say that it was only Mike Baird, I mean, the former Premier of Queensland had spoken a lot about this. I mean, he still talks about it, saying that...
No, I'm not saying it was only Mike Baird, but he was the one who came forward last week.
I think leadership is when all the leaders come to the table and do this. And let's just put partisan politics aside. For our generation, 2.5 of us are going to be working to support every person that's not. Today, it's 7.5, or in the past it's been 7.5. So it's easy to make, a cheap shot about Tony Abbott said this on GST. It's easy to say we can just fix it by, taking on multinationals. But for our country, for the next 50 years, it's going to look very different. And you're going to need political leaders to make decisions that will probably result in them losing.
Bernard wants to jump in.
I want to ask Wyatt, why doesn't he ask in his party room how much all the hype about terrorism is costing, like 900 ASIO and police officers... 900 ASIO and police officers raided Muslim homes all over Australia, and what did they get? They got one plastic sword. And then let me finish. And then how much would it cost to close some of those detention centres for children and women? And why do we accept the debate we've just had about how we allocate how much money we've got in the family purse? How about creating a new family purse? How about the politicians asking what the real cost of some of these Abbott-inspired programs are? Where is the money that's being spent on these detention regimes, on the terrorist hype? Why couldn't that be used to deal with this deprivation of entitlement?
Right, you asked the question of Wyatt. We'll get him to answer. We're running out of time, so I'd have to be brief.
I'll try and be brief. Just to work through this again, the sums of money that you're talking about don't even come close to the sort of funding gap that we need on health and education, particularly health in this country with an ageing population. We spend, and I appreciate your point and your passion on that issue, on detention, but it's not even close. It's a tiny fraction of the amount of money that we actually need. On detention centres, as I have said, I hate people being in detention centres, and we are closing detention centres because we are getting people out of them. We saved about $3 billion in the budget because we have closed detention centres. $3 billion is a great saving because we have closed detention centres and got people... I want to see them closed, Larissa. I want to see them closed. And if you stop people coming in the front in that process and you increase the refugee intake, that is exactly what you can do. But that doesn't fund the health system for the next 50 years.
That's a good point you've made.
It's a great start.
Sorry, guys.
Yeah, in terms of health and education and evidence-based policy, obviously I'm with Larissa on the fact that this country doesn't have a spending problem, it has a revenue problem. We live in a country with unfair taxation. And all of those things, corporate loopholes, Robin Hood, closing them, Robin Hood taxes, negative gearing, the superannuants who are gouging this country, who are going to be gouging more tax out of revenue than pensioners will be being paid by the government. Superannuation is now, is not designed to do, costing us more than the pension. But there's a reality too that the policy ball that has been dropped is the very boring practical one about urban design, urban planning and service delivery. That is not a very sexy issue, but has to do with where people live and how services can be delivered to them. One of the reasons why our costs around hospitals in particular are blowing up is because we have very poor regulation around development. Suburbs springing up in Melbourne, completely unregulated, some of which don't even have footpaths because developers don't provide them, of people in an urban sprawl who, in order to have access to health services, need more hospitals built. And the reality of true leadership is actually looking at the reality of our population, our demographics, how they're going, who we need. One of the things we need with an ageing population is migration. Migrants are agents of economic activity. It has always been thus. Australian prosperity has been based on waves of migration. This alone is an argument to let all the refugees in.
Okay, Van, well done. We're just about out of time. Tim wants to get in. I have to make that our last word, I'm afraid.
I always like having the last word, so that's fine, Tony. If you want to improve the standard of governance in Australia in the service delivery, you need to decentralise governance and you need to decentralise tax collection. You do not want the federal government having more power. Government is always most responsive to the people it serves, the closer it is to the people it serves. And in terms of tax reform, we need a much broader discussion than increasing the GST. If you ever want to read a really interesting book, and I recognise just how boring this will sound, it's called For Good and Evil, The History of Tax in Civilization. But what it shows is throughout all of human history, is if you want a working tax system, it needs to be fair, you need to have taxes that are flat, or relatively flat, to reduce the incentives for people to cheat and for it to be collected on an ongoing basis in a sensible and fair way. And one of the things I don't understand about our taxation system is why it is that we tax people more than companies. Now, that isn't an argument to increase the tax on companies, but it is an argument to remove the incentives, flatten the tax rate so the rate between businesses and people is the same, because by doing so you remove the incentive to set up businesses solely for the purpose of avoiding tax, getting rid of trusts for no purpose and avoiding tax, and then we put everything in the or the real economy so that it can be taxed appropriately, because the only people who win from a complex taxation system is the rich and the powerful, because they can use their resources to avoid it.
Okay. Now, I know that a lot of you will be racing out to download The History of Tax. The rest of you probably want to go and watch. The rest of you probably want to go and watch some music. We're going to let you do that now. Thanks for being such a patient, informed, and passionate audience. Thank you very much, and thanks to our panel. See you next year. Thank you very much.